I'm Haruka, a student from Kyoto who has always been fascinated by ghost stories and haunted places. When I learned about Mount Osarizen, a place reputed to be one of the most haunted in Japan, I couldn't resist my curiosity and decided to visit it. I arranged with some friends, and we went there on a summer weekend. The trip was long and tiring, but the excitement of exploring the mountain kept us motivated. We arrived at Mount Osarizen in the late afternoon. The sun was already setting, and the fog was beginning to cover the mountains. The smell of sulfur was strong, and the silence was unsettling. We left the car in a parking lot near the entrance to the mountain and started climbing the trail. The landscape was beautiful, with volcanic rocks and twisted trees, but also frightening, with an ominous energy in the air. As we walked, we began to hear whispers and moans. It seemed like someone was calling us, but we didn't see anyone. Suddenly one of my friends screamed. He pointed to a tree, where there was a human figure standing. It was a woman dressed in white, with long black hair that covered her face. The woman didn't move, just stared at us. We felt paralyzing fear. We started running, trying to escape the woman. But it followed us, appearing at different points on the trail. We reached the top of the mountain and found a Buddhist temple. We entered the temple and prayed to the spirits, asking for protection. When she appeared inside the temple, she stared at us for a few seconds and pointed outside. We closed our eyes and began to pray with more faith. When we opened our eyes, she had disappeared. We left the temple and ran as quickly as possible. But the feeling that we were being watched remained. We decided to go home for fear of her showing up again. We ran down the trail, without looking back. We got to the car and drove away from Mount Osarizen, relieved to be safe. But the experience marked us forever. We believe that the woman in white was a spirit that inhabits the mountain. We don't know what she wanted, but the experience made us believe in ghosts. If you are going to visit Mount Osarizen, be careful. It's a beautiful place, but also haunted, where the supernatural manifests itself. My name is Kenji, and I'm from Kyoto. I've always been fascinated by ghost stories and haunted places, so when I heard about Mount Osarizen, one of the most haunted places in the country, I couldn't resist visiting it. It was a cold winter night, and my friends and I decided to explore MT. We grabbed our cameras and flashlights and headed there. The mount is in an area surrounded by mountains and dense forests and Buddhist temples. When we arrived at Monte, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The atmosphere was heavy, and the darkness seemed to swallow us. We started to climb, and the feeling of oppression increased. The silence was unsettling, and the only thing we could hear were our own footsteps echoing off the walls. Suddenly we heard a whisper. It sounded like a female voice, weak and distant. We looked everywhere, but we saw nothing. The whisper was repeated, and this time it seemed closer. We started to feel chills and goosebumps. We continued walking upward, and the feeling that we were being watched intensified. We had the impression that there was someone or something following us. Suddenly, a bright light appeared on the summit of Mount Osarizen. We thought it was the highest part of the mount, but when we got closer, we saw that in the light there was a group of monks praying. When we got closer, they disappeared along with the light. Getting a scary darkness. We panicked. We started running, trying to find a safe place. But it felt like we were going in circles. Mount Osarizen seemed to have no end. Finally, we found the trail. We ran away, relieved to be safe. But the feeling of terror did not pass. We looked back and saw a shadow in the middle of the forest. The shadow moved and disappeared. I never returned to Mount Osarizen. The experience was terrifying and made me believe that ghosts exist. Good night. I'm Ayumi, a young woman who grew up hearing legends about Mount Osarizan, a place that fascinates and terrifies me at the same time. I was always curious to explore the mountain, but fear stopped me. Until, last year, I decided to face my fears and venture to Mount Osarizan. I planned the trip carefully, choosing a sunny day and taking everything I needed: water, food, map, and a camera to record the experience. I arrived at the mountain in the morning, and the landscape impressed me: lush green mountains, volcanic rocks, and the Buddhist temple at the top. I started walking up the trail, and the energy of the place enveloped me. It was a mix of peace and mystery, as if the mountain was watching me. On the way, I met other pilgrims, but most of them continued in silence, focused on their prayers. I arrived at the temple and admired the panoramic view. You could see the ocean and mountains all around. I sat on a bench and watched the landscape, trying to relax. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around and saw a human figure standing near a tree. It was a Buddhist monk, dressed in a white robe. The monk approached me and greeted me. We talked for a few minutes, and he told me about the history of the temple and the spirits that inhabit the mountain. It was such a pleasant conversation. There was a calmness, a joy to be there with him. I asked if he had ever seen any ghosts, and he smiled, saying that spirits are everywhere, you just need to know how to observe them. I said goodbye to the monk and continued exploring the mountain. I visited other temples, admired the landscapes, and took many photos of the temples, landscapes, and some signs that talked about that place. At the end of the afternoon, I decided to go back to the city. I walked down the trail carefully, observing the nature around me. When I reached the base of the mountain, I looked back and saw the monk standing in the same place, watching me. I thanked him with a nod and left. When I got home, I went to look at how the photos turned out, to make an album. In one of the photos I took, it was of an old mural, where there were photos of all the monks who lived there. It was a mural from the construction of the temple until the year 2000. At the time I didn't notice anything, but when I paid attention to one of the photos, my legs shook. In the photo on the mural was the monk who talked to me, and said that that photo was from 1912, and he looked exactly the same as he did when he sat next to me. The experience on Mount Osarizan taught me a lot about courage and the importance of respecting sacred places. Now I know that the monk was a spirit, but the encounter marked me forever. If you are going to visit Mount Osarizan, go with an open heart and be ready to connect with the spiritual world. Hey guys. I'm Hiroki, a landscape photographer who loves exploring remote and mysterious places. A few years ago, I decided to spend a night at Mount Osarizan, famous for its natural beauty and legends of ghosts. I arrived at the mountain late in the afternoon. The sun set quickly, and darkness took over the place. The smell of sulfur was strong, and the silence was unsettling. I set up my tent in a secluded spot, near an old abandoned temple. The atmosphere was charged with mystery, and I felt like I wasn't alone. During the night, I heard voices and whispers coming from the temple. I thought they were animals, but the feeling that there was something more disturbed me. Suddenly I saw a dim light in the temple. Curious, I decided to investigate. I entered the temple and saw a group of people dressed in strange clothes. They were performing a macabre ritual, with songs and dances. I was scared and tried to leave the temple, but I was stopped by one of the group members. He looked at me with a threatening look and told me I couldn't leave. I tried to run away, but they grabbed me and tied me to a table. They began to recite words in an unknown language and dance around me. I felt terrible fear. I thought it would be the end of me. Suddenly, a group of tourists appeared, and everything went dark. When the light came back on, the group that tied me up had disappeared. I was alone in the temple, tied to the table. The tourists opened the door and found me there and helped me free myself, and I ran out of the temple, desperate. I didn't even thank those people. I returned to my tent and waited for dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and left Mount Osarizan. I never went back there. I believe the group I saw at the temple was a secret sect that performs macabre rituals on the mountain. Hello, my name is Sakura, and I'm a tour guide in Aomori. I've taken many groups to Mount Osarizan, but I never got used to the atmosphere of the place. It's a sacred but also scary place, with a very strong energy. Last year, I decided to make a solo pilgrimage to Mount Osarizan. I wanted to connect with nature and the spiritual world. I arrived at the mountain late in the afternoon. The sun was setting, and the fog was beginning to cover the mountains. The smell of sulfur was strong, and the silence was unsettling. I started to climb the trail that leads to the top of the mountain. The landscape was beautiful, but at the same time scary, with volcanic rocks and twisted trees. Suddenly I heard a whisper. It sounded like a female voice, weak and distant. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. I continued walking, but the whisper was repeated. This time it seemed closer. I felt a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of me. It was a woman dressed in white, with long black hair that covered her face. The woman didn't move, just stared at me. I felt paralyzing fear. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. The woman approached me and extended her hand. I closed my eyes tightly, expecting the worst. But when I opened my eyes, the woman was gone. I was in shock. I didn't know what had happened. I continued the pilgrimage, but the feeling that I was being watched did not disappear. I reached the top of the mountain and visited the temple. I prayed to the spirits and asked for protection. As I was leaving, I looked back and saw the woman in white standing on top of the hill, watching me. I ran away from Mount Osarizan, terrified. I never went back there. I believe that the woman in white was a spirit that inhabits the mountain. I don't know what she wanted, but the experience left an impression on me forever. If you are going to visit Mount Osarizan, be careful. It is a sacred place, but also haunted, where the supernatural manifests itself.